So I hope you eat really fast, because what I'm going to talk about tonight will make you sick. And particularly eat your entree first before you get into this. I'm going to talk about vegetable oils, which is kind of the flip side of the saturated fat story. So I'm going to talk about mostly things that come from my book, but it's always worth going over. My disclosure statement, important to say I don't receive any money from industry for my work, although I wish I could, but I do receive speaking fees, and you can ask me afterwards, why do the potato people want to talk to me when the potatoes are full of carbs? But otherwise, I'm really unconnected to industry. So what are polyunsaturated vegetable oils? There are these oils that you see here. They really should be called seed oils. They're not from vegetables. They're crushed out of seeds mainly, or beans. And you know, it's funny, now they're called plant oils. I think they kind of keep searching for a name change to give a new name to basically unhealthy product. But and why is it important for this conference to learn about vegetable oils? Well, you know, the ketogenic diet calls for eating much more, many more fats, much higher percentage of fats. Well, so a fundamental question for everybody is, well, which fats should I be eating? And 70-80% of your diet is going to be fat. Well, where should that come from? So that's why I think it's such an important topic, especially for this conference. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the dietary guidelines because, I wanted to sort of pick up where Tim Noakes left off today about why the guidelines are so important, and they're the reason that he was put on trials, basically, because he was giving unconventional advice. What is the convention? The convention is the dietary guidelines, and this is what they recommend, that these are the fats that they say we should eat. So in terms of oils, we should be having 2 tablespoons of these oils every day. And Americans have really done a pretty good job of that. This is the course of the 20th century. We have dramatically increased our consumption. This is from the beginning. Well, because vegetable oils didn't really exist at the beginning of the 20th century, we've increased consumption of them by something like 121,000 times over. They now represent 7 to 8% of all the calories that we eat, and it's mainly soybean oil. So this is, of course, very different than the fats that humans evolved eating. So, and just to go over this, because I really didn't know this when I started out, tallow from beef, suet from lambs and sheep, and then the main fats that we cooked and ate with were lard and butter throughout most of our history, in Western history. Then there's also coconut and palm oil that are in non-Western countries, tropical countries. Just to give an example of this, this quote by Patroclus: "Put a big bench in the firelight and laid it on the backs of a sheep and a fat goat and the chine of a great wild hog, rich in lard." That was a feast for a hero. I still haven't looked up the word chine, but I'm sure it tastes pretty good. So those are the fats that we used to eat. Oops, this is a little bit off the screen for some reason. There weren't vegetables. Oils were really, so they originally we got oils from whales. That was what the whole whaling industry was centered around, getting the oils out of whales, and it was used for the Industrial Revolution. It was used for lubricants, for machinery, and they really were not considered fit. They weren't consumed by humans, and they were also used for, to burn for lamp oil, for light, but it was not something, oils were not something that humans consumed. And then when they destroyed the whale populations, they had to find a new source of oil, and that is when they started, in the South, they had these leftover seeds from producing cotton in the South of the United States, and they started making cottonseed oil. And that is what replaced these whale oils for the Industrial Revolution. And then, first I actually need to take just a moment to kind of explain to you why, so the chemistry of fatty acids. So unsaturated fatty acids are the fatty acids that are in oils, and you can see that they have double bonds between the carbons there. And the double bonds is what creates these kinks in the chain, and that means that the molecules cannot all rest on top of each other, and that's why they're oils, because it creates all this space between the molecules. Saturated fatty acids, like the kind that we have in meat and cheese and butter, they do not have any double bonds. They're straight chains. They lie one on top of the other, and that's why they're solid. They're mainly solid at room temperature because they can all pack together and make a solid. They're also they're also stable because there's no double bonds. Any double bond at any time is an opportunity to kind of, and I'll talk about this later, but it's a time to kind of open up, especially under conditions of heat or light, and bond with an oxygen molecule. Atom. Correction. So this is just a fundamentally important thing to understand because oils are unstable molecules. The unsaturated fatty acids are unstable because they have the potential to react with oxygen. In the early part of the 1900s in the United States, they discovered how to make these unstable molecules stable, and they did that through this process called hydrogenation, and that's really important because basically they took this wiggly molecule and made it into something flat. I don't know if there's a pointer around here somewhere. That would be helpful for me. But this molecule at the bottom shows this is taking linoleic acid, which is a unsaturated fatty acid, and an oil, and making it into something flat, and they're basically hardening oils. They make it into a solid. Well, this was an incredibly important discovery because this is how hydrogenation happens. It goes through this whole long process. When you take cotton seeds, which was the original one, and you press out the oil, it results in this kind of gray, sludgy mixture, and it has to be steamed to eliminate bad odors, it has to be bleached, and then winterized for stability, and enhanced with artificial colors and synthetic vitamins, and that's what it takes to create a vegetable oil coming out of a factory. But once they were able to do this hydrogenation, somebody looked at that hardened vegetable oil and thought, oh, maybe we can feed this to humans. And you have to understand, the people who invented or who patented the process of hydrogenation was Procter & Gamble, which is a soap company, because oils, amongst the many things that they're used for soaps. And so they were making soap out of these hydrogenated oils, and then they decided, well, maybe since we can make it white and it looks sort of like lard, let's sell it as a lard substitute. So this was in 1911 that this happened, and they went through various efforts to figure out a good name for this. It was going to be called Crisco with a T, and somebody realized, oops, that's maybe not politically correct. So then they called it Crisco, and that's how vegetable oils came to be food for humans. And this was actually like a brilliant idea. I mean, there was this huge marketing campaign for Crisco. Americans were, everybody, the sort of immigrants to America, and they were uniquely susceptible to this idea of wanting to modernize. Everybody wanted to modernize, and so they capitalized on this campaign and said, lard is a thing of the past. It comes from dirty animals, and Crisco is made on enamel, clean counter, labs from scientists, and so it doesn't create bad odors in the parlor, and so you could give up lard. Lard was a thing of your grandmother, and I love this picture of the young woman showing her mother the new product of Crisco. Like, this is the wave of the future. And again, Americans, I think, were particularly susceptible to this because we didn't necessarily, as a nation of immigrants, we didn't necessarily have our grandmothers there saying, what is that nonsense you're putting in the kitchen? We are, and immigrants back in those days really wanted to assimilate. So this was why I think in the U.S. in particular there was such an influence of this kind of campaign. And then aside from Crisco, the other way that hydrogenated fats were used was as margarine, as a substitute for butter. Again, they just took the Crisco, they put a little salt in it, they colored it with yellow, and they sold it as margarine. And so that started coming into the food supply as well. And then they figured out how to stabilize just the oils themselves. That was something that was discovered in the 1940s, how to do something called touch hydrogenation, and they were able to sell oils just as oils, which would not quickly go rancid or go bad on the shelf. So this was, so again, and most of these was Procter & Gamble. So how did we come to believe that these oils were good for health? Why do we have a strong belief that this is what we should be eating instead of saturated fats because it lowers your cholesterol? How did that happen? Well, one thing that happened that I dug up during my research was that the American Heart Association was this kind of sleepy little society of cardiologists in the 1940s, because of course heart disease was relatively rare, and so there weren't that many cardiologists. It was a new and growing but still small profession, and they didn't have much money, and so Procter & Gamble went to them and said, we will make you the beneficiaries of this radio contest in 1948, and that is what, according to the American Heart Association's own official company history, that is what sort of overnight converted them into the national powerhouse that they are today, with millions flowing into their coffers, and they opened up chapters all over the country. Well, Procter & Gamble, as you'll remember, is the maker of Crisco oil. Not shortly, but not too long after that, the American Heart Association becomes the first group anywhere in the world to recommend that we replace our saturated fats with unsaturated vegetable oils, polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And this was really like the tiny acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today. I mean, this is where it all began. And this is sort of where we started to have kind of the medicalization of polyunsaturated fats. Like, they're good for your heart. And this is a tremendous boost to this industry, right? Now, all of a sudden, you're having all the cardiologists say, you need to eat these oils to lower your cholesterol, give up saturated fats. You can, even as an 8-year-old, start to worry. That ad actually became the subject of a dispute by the Federal Trade Commission because there is no evidence for this. Of course, there's no evidence for any of it, but and so they had to pull that ad out of circulation. So again, sorry for the slide mess up, but so many of you know the story that the reason that American Heart Association recommendation came about was due to the work largely of Ancel Keys, University of Minnesota pathologist, who came up with the idea and really pushed the idea that saturated fats and dietary cholesterol were bad for health, and that you would be better to replace those with unsaturated fats. So I want to just point out a couple things, like why this was such a crazy idea at the time. Like in the middle there is the rates of heart disease in the United States this is all 20th century data. What is perfectly correlated with heart disease? Not saturated fats. It's the rise of vegetable oils. This is correlation and not causation, but at the time the American Heart Association was coming out with its recommendation, I guess nobody was looking at this data because it really looks to me like polyunsaturated fats is like the last thing that seems likely to cure heart disease in the middle of the 20th century. And also, this was well before the time of Michael Pollan, but what is a natural fat? We're replacing butter that comes from a cow. You can't get skim milk from a cow with a highly industrialized product that can only come out of a factory. So I'm not going to talk about the whole saturated fat story, and I'm just going to skim over this. There's the whole story of why we stayed with this hypothesis for so long. After that American Heart Association recommendation in 1961, which was really based on very weak evidence, there was a tremendous effort to try to show that saturated fats and cholesterol are bad for health, and that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils would improve your cardiovascular risk. And so there were trials that went on all around the world. They used hard endpoints, which is a higher quality of data. A hard endpoint is something like a heart attack or death, hard to dispute that. There's a lot of debate about HDL, LDL, C-reactive protein as intermediary markers. But if you measure whether somebody's died or not, that is something that's relatively indisputable. So, and altogether, there were, depending on how you count, there were trials on tens of thousands of people looking at this hypothesis that Ancel Keys had promoted and that the American Heart Association was already recommending. And the results, and this is the results from multiple meta-analyses and systematic reviews that have taken place now. The most prestigious one is by Cochrane, and they have found no effect of saturated fats on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. So when I say no effect, it's meaningful. We're not just talking about association data. We're talking about data where they look at randomized controlled trials that show cause and effect. So that's rigorous data. And even if you don't believe that data, which some people do not, they say those trials were not well done and they were not well controlled. You're back to the start where it's still just a hypothesis then that hasn't been tested. So in all of these clinical trials, they did successfully reduce total cholesterol, which is I think a marker that the trials were actually fairly well controlled because they were able to see a real difference between the diet and the control groups, but it had no effect on mortality, cardiovascular mortality. And in nearly a dozen of these studies, and this is really not very well known, but in quite a number of these studies, they found this. This is just one example, that the group that was eating more soybean oil, more corn oil, more polyunsaturated fats, and lowered their cholesterol more, had higher death rates from cancer. So this was found in nearly a dozen of these trials, which is really serious. I mean, it was so serious that the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute had a series of high-level panels in the early 1980s to discuss it. What was going on with this side effect of cancer? And they really could not resolve it. And I spoke to the guy who was the rapporteur of these meetings, and he said, "What? It's 25 years later, and they still haven't gotten to the bottom of this issue." It was considered a very serious issue, and they had another follow-up meeting in 1990. Can we do anything about that? That there was a real problem of significantly increased death rates from cancer for people who had lowered their cholesterol, and they couldn't figure out what the issue was, whether it was the lowering the cholesterol or it was the vegetable oils themselves. They could not come to an explanation, and they concluded that it was just so important to be on a cholesterol-lowering diet for heart disease that they would disregard the data on cancer. So what is the data for polyunsaturated vegetable oils in cancer? Well, in the early 1940s, they did quite a number of experiments on rats that are disgusting to read about, frankly. And this is particularly if the oils are heated, because remember that effect of the double bonds opening up and reacting with oxygen. Chemical reactions tend to speed up under conditions of heat. So they found this was quite a large body of literature showing. I'm going to move this down just a little. I don't know if there's a tech person here to help. But anyway, there was clearly some indication here. There were letters to the editors of various journals saying, hold on, in the 1950s saying, hold on, let's not be so quick to adopt polyunsaturated vegetable oils. What about this animal data? Then there was a conference that I found from the early 1970s where Japanese researchers, there was an international conference, but they had found that heat, especially under conditions of heat, soybean oil was toxic to mice, and that the oils became oxidized under heat and caused liver damage and heart lesions. Again, really, really worrisome data. And then I couldn't find any conferences or meetings on this topic subsequently. So, as you know, who would fund a conference like this? One of the things that happens in science, as everybody knows, is you need to have sponsors and you need to have commercial interests to sponsor any kind of scientific discussion. And if there's no commercial interest, and there's certainly, the people who produce vegetable oils, I mean, just so you understand the commercial interest here, we're talking about ADM, Monsanto, Cargill, Bunge, Lotus Crocklin. I mean, some of the biggest companies in the world are all vegetable oil producers. So there really was no interest in furthering this field of scientific study. So what is the result of having these oils in our food supply? Well, one of the amazing things that happened to me in the late stages of writing my book was that I talked to, I was originally going to write a book on trans fats. And so I spent the first 2 years talking to vegetable oil executives. So I know an amazing number of vegetable oil executives in all these companies. And one of them called me up, who was clearly just fed up with his job. And he said, do you know what's happening in the fast food industry? He said in Burger King and in McDonald's and in all these restaurants where ever since we got rid of trans fats, so understand that we used to have the purpose of hydrogenation, as you'll remember, is to stabilize those oils, right? One of the byproducts of hydrogenation is trans fats. We discovered that. We discovered trans fats are bad for health. All the experts decided to get rid of all the hydrogenated oils in our food supply. What was available then for companies to use for their fryers? Well, they had to go back to the regular old non-stabilized oils. Regular old soybean oil, regular non-stabilized corn oil. And so this happened in the early 2000s, that all these companies started changing over. And he said, we're in a crisis in our industry because these regular oils are highly unstable. He said, we had this problem where in all the fast food joints, the oils were polymerizing and turning into a shellac-like substance, if you remember the mouse experiment with the varnish. He said that's turning into a shellac-like substance that is coating the walls and clogging the drains of all of our fryers and coating the walls of the establishment of the fast food kitchens. And they had to develop a new cleaner, a new, more chemically potent cleaner to get this shellac-like polymerized, basically paint off their walls, that it was part of the oxidized oils coming out of their fryers. Worse, they said it was so unstable, these oxidation products that were being produced, that the uniforms of the workers would spontaneously combust when they took them to be cleaned in the back of the truck. They had fires in the back of the truck, taking them to the cleaners, and then even after they had been cleaned, they put them in the dryer, and because of the heat of the dryer, they were having exploding dryers. So this was a huge problem in the industry. And, you have to wonder, and what about the people eating this food, right? Not only the workers who are inhaling these fumes, but what about us, humans? So again, let's go back to linoleic acid. Linoleic acid is polyunsaturated. It's the major fatty acid. It is highly unstable, and when it's heated, it degrades into these free radicals, degraded triglycerides. It becomes oxidized into hundreds of toxic oxidation products, and one of which is called aldehydes, which are they're a known toxin. They're classified as a toxin. And this is Hermann Estabauer was really the founder of the field of he's from Austria, of studying aldehydes. They're almost impossible to study because everything is oxidizing and degrading and changing so quickly that it's almost impossible to isolate aldehydes, even to study them. So they found there's just a large literature on this, on aldehydes, about them messing with DNA and RNA and causing heart disease and causing cancer. And it's a very disturbing literature to read. And is this indeed getting into these oils? Are they getting into our food? Well, yes, they are. This was a study that was done looking at fried chicken in soybean oil. This is a study that has just recently been published by the leading professor looking at aldehydes in the United States, and she went to all of her local, she's at the University of Minnesota, she went to all the local fast food joints and just got French fries and studied them to see how many aldehydes they had in them, and found out actually quite a lot. So if you regularly eat French fries, you're ingesting a significant amount of aldehydes. And that's just one of the oxidation products that is in these foods. So, it is really deeply worrisome, and it makes you wonder, I used to just laugh at this hypothesis that it's eating out that makes us unhealthy. Because I always used to say, it depends what you eat when you go out. Are you going to get a huge bowl of pasta? Are you going to get a steak? Is the act of going to a restaurant making you ill? But in fact, it may be true because, I think virtually all restaurants use these oils because they're cheap. And I don't know how many of you know, but raise your hand if you know a restaurant that cooks with lard. I know one in New York City. There is, they all cook with these vegetable oils. And ironically, you are probably more likely to encounter unhealthy food in like a little mom and pop restaurant that never changes their oils because they're expensive. And it's probably healthier to go to a McDonald's or a Burger King because they have come up with, they take these kinds of problems very seriously, and they have come up with all kinds of ways to stabilize their oils, including, literally, they have nitrogen blankets that they have put on top of their fryers, and they have little silicone beads to absorb the oxidation products that they put into the oil, and they change their oils frequently, and that is not true of, your basic local Thai food place. So I think, is everybody done now eating? It's like, I feel like the talk is gone, it's like all the forks have gone really silent. But maybe there's no food left. So which oils to use? And this is sort of the practical point. The blue is the linoleic acid. So you want to minimize, first of all, you do not want to cook with any oil. You really want to cook with a solid, stable fat, like lard, butter, ghee, coconut oil, although it's an oil, is very high in saturated fats, tallow, suet. But if you're going to use, an oil for a salad dressing or a sauce or whatever, you want to use one that is low in linoleic acid, and that means you want to use, so none of these. Olive oil is really the best one here. I think. And maybe flaxseed oil, although, which has alpha linoleic acid, but I think that's relatively stable as far as I know. But you really do not want to be using the oils that we most commonly consume, which is soybean oil, peanut oil, corn oil. They're very high in linoleic acid. This is another chart that just has some more oils, including some of the more recent ones, macadamia and avocado oils, which are newly on the market. They are pretty close to the profile of olive oil, so they seem to me to be pretty good options. But canola oil is so-so, and there are other oils on the market. There's something like a high oleic sunflower oil that should be better because oleic is like olive oil, they have, they're higher in monounsaturated fats. And so just so you understand that mono means there's only one double bond, so there's only one opportunity to oxidize. So in general, the monounsaturated fats they're more stable than poly, many double bonds, they don't oxidize as much. So that's the take-home message of that. And again, I just have to go back to why I got involved in, wanting to try to work on the dietary guidelines. This is not clearly, it's questionably healthy. I think that, we know that polyunsaturated fats can lower your total cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, but, that equation does not take in the full consideration of potentially, inflammatory oxidative effects of these oils, and it's a narrow understanding of those oils. So I did get involved in trying to change the dietary guidelines, like Professor Noakes. I made myself extremely popular by publishing an article that that was the subject of a huge retraction effort. I mean, possibly the biggest ever retraction effort. And a couple of things that it found was that the Dietary Guideline Committee had not been able to find any of the low-carb literature, despite the fact that there is, at the time, there were dozens and dozens of clinical trials already published. There's been nearly 20 years of a very robust scientific literature on the low-carb diet, but they couldn't find any of it. That was one finding. And the other one, kind of relevant to what I'm talking about, is that they had never, ever directly reviewed any of the clinical trials on saturated fats. They had never looked at that huge body of literature on tens of thousands of people, which is amazing. All of that literature was funded, much of it was funded by the National Institutes of Health, paid for by taxpayer dollars to inform dietary policy. And yet it just had sort of become like silent studies, really until Gary Taubes and myself and others started to bring these trials back to the attention of researchers, and researchers like Ron Krauss examine them. Did we start to talk again about these clinical trials, which had otherwise just sort of disappeared? So that's why I started the Nutrition Coalition. We are not for any one diet. We do not accept any industry money. We are all just about evidence-based policy. We just want policy based on the evidence. I may be wrong, but my understanding of the evidence is that if we were to examine the evidence rigorously and properly prioritize clinical trials over epidemiology, we would have a low-carb diet pattern for people to follow, and it wouldn't be a taboo option. And why focus on the dietary guidelines? And this is a busy chart, but it explains just what an incredible amount of control they have over our food supply and what we think is healthy eating. I think that the bottom-up movement is incredible. The momentum for change is incredible in communities, but it is true the dietary guidelines have this kind of vise-like hold on much of of what we think about food. Because just to point out a few things here, it controls all the feeding assistant programs that come out of USDA, which is by far the largest budget item at USDA. It's all the school lunches and the feeding programs for the elderly and women and infant children programs, which, by the way, is a food basket that includes 0 meat now. I think maybe 1 egg a month, and it controls all the what's taught in schools, and I think really importantly, it's just downloaded virtually by all the professional associations with very little change, so that everybody working on the front line, every doctor, nutritionist, dietitian, nurse, they really teach the dietary guidelines, and in many cases, doctors are really not allowed to if they work in a big medical practice, they're in some cases really not allowed to teach anything else. Because they will get in trouble for not being evidence-based. Let's hope they don't get taken to court, like Professor Noakes. Anyway, also the military is a big one. We have now 2/3 of the military, mirroring the American population, is now overweight or obese, which is incredible. And they affect the whole food supply. The reason we have lean beef in supermarkets and you cannot get kind of regular fatty beef is because of the dietary guidelines. That really changed. And it all started in 1980. I once went to the supermarket and said, could you make me some ground beef that is 40% fat? And the person in the supermarket was like, no, you're killing yourself. You cannot do that. So I mean, everybody believes the dietary guide. Even if you don't go to a .gov website to get your dietary advice, it reaches you, even you, a supermarket worker. So that's my inspirational quote. We are. There's another one by Albert Einstein that I like, which is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So we've been doing the dietary guidelines since 1980, and let's look at our results and maybe try something else. So I'm relatively hopeful. This is where the Nutrition Coalition is. Come visit us without the typo. Gee, I don't know how to spell nutrition. That's embarrassing. And that's it. Thank you very much. I hope you can enjoy your dessert.